Look good? Think, right? Got my face?
Yeah, sort of.
Top of your head, yeah.
We need to lean back.
Yeah, just
Okay,
lean back.
just lean back, okay.
Want me to fix it?
You can try to fix it, that's fine. Yeah, if you, is
That's
this
good,
good right here?
that's good.
Okay, alright, let's get started, guys. So again, there should be a sheet coming around, make sure you put your name on that, and then somebody write like chapter 5 through 8 test on the top of it and put the date. I passed the sheet around, so everybody make sure you have your name on it. For those of you that are watching this video at home, again, you gotta take notes. Make sure you put the time signatures on the left-hand side, so you're indicating like right at the start, you're giving directions. 1 minute in, you talk about test format and all that stuff, okay? So make sure as you're writing, you include random time signatures. Just follow the time bar on YouTube and identify that. Okay, so as you all know, there's only one option for the take-home essay. Basically, there's 2 articles that you have to read, and that basically has to do with how you're going to respond to somebody that identifies as transgender. What should you do specifically? So I've handed that out. If you have questions, feel free to talk to me. In terms of test format, as I briefly mentioned in class, the test is 100 points. So it's 100 questions, although Schoology identifies the questions a little bit differently. So technically, Schoology says there's 51 questions. So in terms of format, it's on 4 chapters, right? Chapter 5 is on groups and organizations. They switched the order of the chapters. Chapter 5 is on social and mass media. Chapter 6 is on groups and organizations. Chapter 7 is on sexuality and society. And then Chapter 8 is on deviance. All right? As best as I can, I try to make the tests a roughly equal representation. So there's approximately the same number of questions from each chapter. All right? So there's 40 multiple choice questions. So there's 10 from each chapter. Like I literally pulled them from the question banks and counted and made sure that there were exactly 10 from each chapter. So I read through them and I picked questions that I think were a good sample. For the multiple choice questions, most of those are application questions. So it gives you a scenario and then you have to apply it and answer a question. It's not simply like, what is the definition of this, right? So there's 40 multiple choice questions, 10 from each chapter, that ask you to apply the concepts largely. Then there's 40 matching questions in groups of 10. Those are straight terms. So it gives you a term, and then you have to match the term to the definition. In the case of the chapter on mass media, I just did that one today. I know that the questions are word for word. There's like 8 terms on the note card page in the app if you're using that. The term, those exact 8 ones are in there, and then there's like 2 other ones, okay? And it's word for word. In terms of the other ones, there might be some subtle differences in the wordings from the old edition of the book to the new one, but they're largely the same, right? So it might not be identical wording, but it's pretty darn close. So there's 10 of those from every chapter. Then there's a question that has 14 options. It's a matching section. And it basically will give you a quote or a statement or a claim, and you have to identify which of the 4 main theories we've talked about: functionalism, conflict theory, those are the macro theories, right? And then symbolic interactionism and exchange theory, which of those best matches the quote, okay? So there's 14 of those. It's just a statement, you have to pick which one. And that's like, there's 4 different theories, so that you might use functionalism 5 times and conflict theory 3 times and exchange theory twice. You don't know how many times you're going to use each one, right? You'll use each one at least once, but other than that, you don't know. And then there's like 6 random multiple choice questions that relate to like just broad scope stuff in sociology. So it might ask you to apply functionalism in general, or what is the definition of functionalism, or something like that, right? So it's broad theory stuff that comes up over and over again, okay? So I want to spend most of the time today talking about the chapter on groups and organizations, because I was sick and then I left like instructions for you to read through and use the app to kind of learn that. So I want to make sure that I spend most of my time addressing things within that specific chapter. So as soon as this loads, we'll talk about it. I want to make sure I don't miss anything here. Or I can just start talking.
Do you mind moving into the mouse, please?
Establishing a secure connection. There we go. Okay, so in the text, they identify the difference between what's called a primary and a secondary group. Okay, a primary and a secondary group. What's the difference between a primary and a secondary group? This again is going to be from chapter 6, Groups and Organizations. Primary and secondary group.
Primary group is like the main people you're around, like
Family,
friends.
best friends. Yep. Yep. So a primary group is a group that tends to be smaller, and it tends to be focused on just the meaning you get from being in the group and like support and closeness. It's not as focused on trying to accomplish a task, or it's not as what's called task oriented. Okay? Secondary groups are groups where the focus is more about trying to accomplish some type of task. Okay? So let me give you some examples, and then I want you to identify whether it's a primary or a secondary group. So family, primary group, okay? Like the company you work at, secondary group, okay? Let's say like your college roommates that you've lived with for 3 years, primary group, right? Let's say like you're in class and you get put in a group for a project for like a month or something. Secondary. Again, it's possible that members of that group could also be part of a primary group. So like let's say you get to pick your groups and you pick your 2 best friends, right? But the nature of the group and the class is more secondary, okay? So then what's a social group? What's the definition for that? What variables do you need? You obviously need 2 or more people, right, that identify with each other. So if you're walking next to somebody at the mall just randomly, you're not a group, right? There's 2 of you, you're right by the person. Let's say you're roughly the same age, you're both males, you're both white guys, you're both Christians, whatever, okay? You're not a group because you don't identify together, right? So you have to have 2 or more people that identify with each other and that interact together for some type of purpose. So otherwise it's not a group. So again, to have a group, 2 or more people identify with each other, interact for a purpose specifically. Okay? So people that share a status are not a group. Like, so if you talk about like Catholics or CEOs of businesses or whatever, they're not a group, they're what's referred to as a category instead. So a category of people are people that share a common status. Okay, and then another thing that's close to a group that's not necessarily a group would be a crowd. So a crowd is a form of like a loose collection of people that generally doesn't interact as if they're a group. They might change into a group. There might be something that happens that they like interact as a group because they identify with each other for a moment, but then after something happens, they could change back into a crowd. So a classic example of that is like at a football game, right? So the student section at a football game largely would be a crowd, not a group. Okay, there's people you don't know in there, like, but let's say like it's a state championship game and then somebody stands up and is like, defense, and like whoever and then they get everybody to clap and everybody in the student section is now working together to try to pump up the team, right? It's changed from a crowd to a group in that instance. Do you see? Because now you have 2 or more people, they identify with each other and they're interacting for a purpose. So be able to distinguish between those things, okay? As I mentioned, primary and secondary groups, the main distinction, it's not just size. So again, size is part of it. Primary groups tend to be smaller, but it also has to do with purpose and closeness, okay? So primary groups are small social groups whose members share personal and lasting relationships. They tend again to be more emotional focused. Whereas secondary groups tend to be larger, tend to be impersonal social groups that pursue a specific goal or activity. Now it's common for secondary groups to turn into primary groups, right? So some of you play basketball. The first time you started playing on a team together with people from West Fargo, like you just met them, right? You're coming together to play basketball, that's the purpose. But over time, you become close to those people, right? So like my softball team I've been playing with for 13, 14 years. Two of the guys on the team, they're brothers, Ryan and Tyler. Their dad passed away 3 weeks ago, okay? And I think like 2/3 of the team was at the funeral, right? So we like hug him, like we care, we've became friends. So it started as a secondary group, now it's turned into a primary group, right? Okay, so primary groups tend to be smaller, tend to be about the relationships. Secondary groups tend to be bigger and tend to be goal-oriented, okay? So be able to identify some of those differences between primary and secondary groups. Also, when you talk about group leadership, right? In group leadership, you have what's called instrumental leadership and expressive leadership, okay? Instrumental leadership and expressive leadership. Instrumental leadership, you just read the definition, it's group leadership that focuses on the completion of tasks. Whereas expressive leadership is group leadership that's focused on a group's well-being. So if you have a business, let's say, let's talk about principals here at West Fargo High School, right? Ideally, you have a leader that does both, right? They're good at getting like the teachers to do what they're supposed to do, but they also express themselves in a manner that the teachers know that the principals care about them, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so there are some leaders that maybe emphasize more on like the instrumental side or on the expressive side, but ideally good leaders do both. So, I'll say this not so much as a knock on them, but just talk about personality differences, right? And I like both of them a lot. I think they do a great job. Dr. Peters and Dr. Fremsted, right? You familiar with who they are? Mm-hmm. Okay. Who's more expressive in nature? Fremsted, right? Okay. Who's more instrumental in their leadership style? Getting stuff done, Dr. Peters, right? So, again, Dr. Peters, I think, is a good guy that really does care about me and all that stuff, right? But his style is more instrumental. It's more about getting stuff done. Those of you that have been in activities and have coaches, sometimes there's like assistant coaches that take on that role. Like one of the coaches is more about making sure that the people feel valued and are socially and mentally in a good place. Somebody else is like, hey, we got to practice. Let's do stuff. Let's get stuff done, right? Getting stuff done is instrumental leadership. Making sure people are doing what they're supposed to and feeling good, is expressive leadership, okay? In the text, they also talk about leadership styles. So you have what's called authoritarian leadership style, authoritarian, democratic leadership, and laissez-faire leadership. Authoritarian, democratic, and laissez-faire. Okay, so authoritarian leadership, if you've ever heard the term authoritarian states or governments in reference to like the Soviet Union under Stalin or China under Mao Zedong or China right now, right? Because they have concentration camps or doing all kinds of bad stuff. That's an authoritarian leadership style. So if you have a leader that's authoritarian, what do? They don't care about you. They dominate you. Yeah, they dominate. So have you heard the expression, it's my way or the highway, right? So they're like, here's what we're doing, get on board or get a new job or go somewhere else, right? That's an authoritarian leadership style. Democratic is, look at the name, it's more democratic, right? It seeks to have involvement from people. It allows people to have a say in what they're trying to accomplish. Laissez-faire is a term that was originally used economically. So if you remember The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith in economics class, laissez-faire literally means to let alone or to leave alone. So the idea with laissez-faire leadership is you have a leader that has a title of leader, but they don't actually make any decisions. They let the group kind of run the show, okay? So it really depends on the situation and who's actually in the group and what the goal of the group is. But laissez-faire leadership generally tends to be the least effective in promoting group goals, like in accomplishing stuff, right? Because groups need some direction. If you show up for practice and the coach is like, do whatever you want, I don't care, and then left, like, you wouldn't get as much stuff done probably, right? So, but at the same time, if you had an authoritarian leader that's like, here's what we're doing, we don't care, like that can backfire too, right? So it really depends on the situation, okay? So do you understand the difference between those styles? And could you apply those? Okay. Let's talk about some classic research that was discussed in the chapter on groups and organizations. Solomon Asch, Stanley Milgram, and Irving Janis are the three big names to remember with that. Solomon Asch did the line study. Asch was studying conformity. Conformity is when you change your behavior to match the people in a group, right? I think I did a little bit of notes on this, like the day before we had the storm. And then we had the storm day and then the 3 days that I was sick. So anyways, Asch wanted to see whether people would conform to the decisions of a group or not, even if the group was obviously wrong, right? So he had lines up and he asked people to match, like which line matched another line, and it was very obvious that certain lines were wrong, but he didn't necessarily care whether the lines were wrong or not. He wanted to see if people would say the wrong thing in order to conform to the group. Okay, and he found that in many instances people were willing to conform. Having even one person that objected also, so let's say you had a room of 30 people and one other person said, no, I don't think that's right, okay, made it much more likely that other people would not conform. In the case of Stanley Milgram, Milgram talked about obedience, okay? So what's the difference between conformity and obedience? What's the difference between conformity and obedience?
You can choose.
No, you can choose in both, technically.
Obedience, you're like listening to what someone tells you to do, and conformity, you're like doing what everyone else does.
Well, no, in conformity you could be listening to what somebody else tells you to.
Changing?
No, you're changing in both. So the key variable is authority, all right? The key variable is authority. In conforming, you're changing your behavior to match people that are roughly the same standing as you, right? Your peers, okay? In obedience, you're listening to either a direct or implied request from an authority figure, right? So there's an expert or there's a teacher or a cop or whatever, and they're trying to get you to obey, to comply with their requests. That's obedience if it's an authority figure. If it's somebody that is roughly the same standing as you, that's conformity. So in the case of Stanley Milgram's study, Milgram wanted to know if people would obey the request of an authority figure, even if it could potentially harm other people. So in Milgram's study, they had people hooked up to machines that would shock them, and then there was like an expert, like the scientist, and then a person getting asked questions. They were doing word pairs mostly in the study, and then somebody else would have to like push the button if they got it wrong. So let's say Maddie is like the person that's like reading the word pairs, and then in the studies the person was in a different room, okay, but it was really a recording, you know, to try to control the variables. So they'd push a button that would say they're going to get shocked, and then the person in the different room would respond like, ow, or that hurts. And there were like labels on the machine that said like serious injury or death could occur, and they wanted to see like how far people would go past that. And they found people were willing to shock people if an authority figure, an expert, basically said it was okay. Can you make sure that's still recording? Is it still?
It's so
Okay.
boring.
Can you like just touch the screen somewhere to make sure it doesn't go to sleep? Don't stop it, but is it good? Okay, thank you. All right, so Milgram actually had family members that survived the Holocaust, and the reason Milgram did his study is when you talked about like the Nuremberg trials or the Tokyo trials, where they actually took like Nazis and were like, why did you run these concentration camps? Why did you torture these people? Everybody said that they were following orders, right? Everybody said, well, somebody above me told me to. And Milgram wanted to understand, like, why would people follow authority that was asking them to do something that was really wrong? And there's usually a video I play about this that's really kind of scary, but there was a case at a McDonald's probably about 12 years ago now, where some dude called up and said he was a cop and like ordered the manager to strip search some like 17-year-old girl that worked there. And it's like super messed up, okay? But they have it all on video, like there's a security camera, and then McDonald's paid like a big penalty, and then the guy got arrested, and because there was like a guy and a girl doing this strip search, and it was super messed up. So that's a modern example of the Milgram experiment. The last example of something is Irving Janis's groupthink. So Janis is Janis. Groupthink is the tendency of group members to come to a conclusion, to conform and reach a decision, even though they might not be making the best decision. It's where groups narrow their decision and want to like come to a decision, even if there's some hesitation within the group to make a decision. So examples of that include like if you have a very strong leader and there's a time deadline, like you have to make a decision. Let's say there's 6 people on some business committee that have to make a decision. And like a couple people might be hesitant about making the decision, but if the leader and like somebody else that's perceived as like important or popular say like we should do this, everybody else doesn't want to challenge their authority and they just go along with it in order to not like rock the boat or whatever. That's an example of groupthink, okay? The classic example they use in history is the Bay of Pigs invasion under JFK administration, where we sent a bunch of people to Cuba to try to overthrow the Cuban government. There were a whole bunch of people that were hesitant to do that, but because JFK came out so strong in favor of it, they didn't speak up. So then later, when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, JFK actually had like social psychologists helping him. So how do you prevent groupthink? That's another important thing the text talks about. One is if you have to make a decision, if you engage in brainstorming first, like let people anonymously write down their ideas or vote for their ideas without having the leader like come out and say what they think, that helps to get better ideas. The other thing is, again, when you have a leader, making sure that the leader isn't so like direct and domineering and kind of making a decision. Okay, we also talked about in this chapter the idea of reference groups. So a reference group is a group that you use to like evaluate yourself when you're trying to make a decision. So you try to like emulate their behavior. So if you go to like basketball games, I think they still do this where they have like elementary age kids. Well, you can pay a little bit and then they can come out on the floor and dribble and they'll get a jersey and they introduce the elementary kids. Do they still do that, Becker? The like Packer Pals basketball thing, where like the little kids get introduced at the same time. Do you remember? Do they do that still or not?
Not really for basketball. We do it for volleyball.
Okay, you do it for volleyball? Okay, so you got like the elementary kids, they look up to the high school volleyball players and they want to emulate them, right? So the high school volleyball team is like a reference group for the elementary kids. We have student teachers that work in our department, right? The Solstice teachers here are like the reference group for the student teachers. They want to figure out how to be a teacher, they kind of copy them. So you understand what a reference group is then? Okay. All right. In groups and out groups. So an in group is the group you're part of. So like West Fargo Packer students are the in group. An out group would be like Cheyenne students, right? Some interesting research on perception of groups. People tend to perceive their group members' behavior more positively than members of an out group, okay? So if you're walking down the hall or you're at the mall and you see like, randomly see some West Fargo students sprinting like in the mall and like laughing and doing something, you might interpret that, because you're a West Fargo student, right? That they're like doing it as part of a joke or there's a reason for them doing it. If you see somebody from like Fargo South or Cheyenne doing it, you might be like, oh, they're idiots because they're from Fargo South or whatever, right? So you tend to interpret people that are part of your in-group better than people that are part of an out-group. Group size, if it's 2 people, it's called a dyad. If it's 3 people, what do you think it's called? A triad, right? Okay, so be aware of that. Then also, last thing I'll talk about for this section is elements of a bureaucracy. Oh, actually, there's 2 more things I need to talk about. Types of organizations and then elements of bureaucracy. So Ed Zioni studied types of organizations and found that there's largely 3 different types of organizations. There's what's called normative organizations. utilitarian organizations, and coercive organizations. So utilitarian organizations are organizations that you're part of because you get something out of it. So you work somewhere largely because you want to get paid, right? You join some group because you want to get the scholarship or whatever. That's a utilitarian organization because it provides you utility or a reward or some happiness. Normative organizations are organizations you join because you believe in the mission of the organization. So like the text uses the example of the PTO, parent-teacher organization, right? They have those at every elementary school. People join those because they want to help out. Churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, those are examples of normative organizations. People join those not so much because they like want to get paid or whatever, it's because they believe in the mission of the organization. And then a coercive organization is an organization that you have to be part of because of something, okay? So school, for a lot of people, at least until you turn 16, is a coercive organization. Why?
Law.
You have to be there by law until you turn 16, right? College is not a coercive organization. What would college be?
Utilitarian.
Yeah, largely utilitarian, right? Because you're going there so you can get a diploma, so you can get a better job someday, right? So be able to identify what types of organizations are what. Okay, so let's talk about bureaucracies now. A bureaucracy is an organizational model that's modeled off of rationality and efficiency. So bureaucracies, rationality, or there's logic behind how it's structured, right? And then efficiency, it's trying to accomplish tasks as quickly as possible. Weber is a sociologist that studied bureaucracies, and he identified what's called the 6 elements of a bureaucracy. Okay, so like things that all bureaucracies have, all right? If you look in the text, it's 6.2. You can see this. For the sake of time, I'm not going to explain all of them, but in short, it's specialization. So specialization is like West Fargo High School is a bureaucracy, right? So we have like cooks, and we have social studies teachers and science teachers, because it'd be too hard for like me to know everything I need to know to like teach anatomy and calculus and whatever, right? So we specialize. There's also a hierarchy of positions. We have a principal, assistant principals, department chairs, right? There's clear structures about who's on top of the other person. There's rules and regulations, policies, right? People get promoted in the bureaucracy based on some type of technical competence. Like, I have a teaching license, you have to have a degree to get a teaching license, right? If you want to be an administrator, you have to have a principal's license or a superintendent's license. So there's a measure of what's called technical competence. There's impersonality, so they tend to treat people based on the regulations, not as unique individuals. And then there's also a lot of formal written communication. So again, I don't want to explain that too much for the sake of time, but make sure you understand those. Again, that's Max Weber, but it's spelled with a W for his last name because he's German, okay? So Weber came up with those 6 elements of a bureaucracy. Last thing from that chapter is the idea of what's called McDonaldization. So like McDonald's, right? McDonaldization. So McDonaldization is a model of running organizations that emphasizes uniformity and predictability. So it's not emphasizing like uniqueness or like trying to necessarily come up with something creative. It's predictability. So you go to McDonald's, right, and you order a Big Mac here or in Dickinson or in Los Angeles, right? It's gonna be pretty similar, correct? Like, you know what to expect. You go to Starbucks and you get a venti white mocha or whatever you want at Starbucks, right? You know that if you get it here, it's going to be pretty much the same as if you get it in Chicago, okay? So that's the idea with McDonaldization. Make things more predictable for customers, make it uniform. It's easier for them to want to buy into that brand because they're pretty much guaranteed to get the same thing all the time. Okay, so I'm going to stop and ask if anybody has any questions on groups and organizations. So that's crash course on groups and organizations. Okay, so with that, let's move on to chapter 6 on sexuality, just kind of go in order. So, understanding some terms for sexuality, you've got the term sex. Sex is more nature-based, right? So sex is the term used to determine biologically whether somebody's male or female, okay? Gender has more to do with the like social construction of what it means to be male or female. So sex is more nature-based in the sociological sense. Gender is more cultural-based, okay? In the text, it also talked about the difference between what's called primary sex traits and secondary sex traits. So be able to identify those. Primary sex traits would be the things that biologically make people males or females. So, you know, testicles, ovaries, vaginas, stuff like that. In the case of secondary sex traits or characteristics, that's deeper voices in males, facial hair, breasts in females. Those are the secondary sex characteristics, okay? Then what's the difference between sexual orientation and then gender identity? The text talked about that also. What's the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity?
Sexual orientation is your attraction.
Gender identity is what you think your gender is.
Okay, yeah. So it's possible for you to be like, in the sociological sense now, gender identity, you could identify as a female, and then this is where it gets kind of tricky because some transgender individuals that identify as female still have male anatomy but identify themselves as lesbians, okay? So your sexual orientation involves what you're attracted to. Gender identity refers to the gender that you identify with, okay? What's the term for people that are attracted to members of the same sex? Homosexual, okay. Opposite sex? Heterosexual, okay. Both sexes? Bisexual, okay. And then what's the term for people that lack sexual attraction? Asexuality, okay. All right. What are people that have biological characteristics of both males and females? Intersexual. And then individuals that feel that they are one sex even though they're biologically a different one. Transsexual, okay? All right, so those are the terms for that in a nutshell. Let's go on to chapter 7 on deviance, okay? Or excuse me, chapter 8 on deviance. Talk about those terms a little bit, and then I'll give you some scenario questions. We talked about labeling theory a little bit today. Labeling theory is a sub-theory of SI that says that deviance is not so much the nature of the act, but it's how people identify or label the act and then how they respond accordingly, okay? Tomorrow we'll talk about control theory. Control theory basically says that what matters in trying to understand deviance is the perception that individuals have regarding the likelihood that they'll get caught for being deviant or not, and the likelihood that people will make a big deal out of it, right? So if like you think, if you're late coming home, you have a curfew of 11, and you know that your mom is like, if you're 5 minutes late, your mom's gonna freak out, right? Okay, and you also know that your mom sits up and watches TV and will for sure be waiting for you to get home, right? Or like in the case of my daughter, I have the Ring door alarm system, so when my daughter's old enough, I'll just manually set that so that when she gets home, like an alarm will go off if she gets in past a certain time, right?
Are you serious?
So, oh yeah, yep. Do you think I'm being serious or not?
Yes. I hope not.
If I tell her 11 o'clock, I'm setting that alarm for 11:01. She walks in late, there's an alarm that's going off. We'll know that she's coming home late, right? Cool.
What if she goes in the back door?
There's alarms on everything at my house.
Oh, man.
There is.
Okay. Yep. See, I like to mess with students because they don't know if I'm serious or not.
Oh, you're serious.
So, you think I'm serious?
Oh, yeah.
Think I'm serious?
I think you're serious.
Well, so anyways, control theory basically says when you want to understand deviance and whether people are deviant or not, you have to basically figure out what their perception is. Like, how big of a deal are people going to make out of the deviance, and how likely are they to get caught, right? So when I supervise dances, right, I will kick people out if I see them dancing badly, okay? But you know how everybody crams together? It's like really hard to see if people are dancing badly in the middle, okay, and see what's going on. So people that are in the middle kind of are banking on the assumption that they're not going to really get caught, right? Or that maybe somebody will just talk to them and say, knock it off, right? So control theory basically tries to get into people's minds to figure that out, okay? We'll talk about some of this tomorrow, but what's the difference between organized crime, corporate crime, and white collar crime?
Mafia. You got the mafia for organized crime.
Okay, so organized crime is crime carried out by an organization, and the organization exists by definition to break the law, okay? So it's not like a business that like has a legitimate purpose, let's say an auto dealership, right? And the auto dealership, like some accountant there like cooks the books to make it look like they didn't sell as much, so they have to pay less taxes, right? So that's not organized crime because the business has a legitimate purpose, right? That would be an example of corporate crime. So corporate crime is where somebody or people in a business break the law like to benefit the business, okay? White collar crime is where somebody uses their position within the business to break the law to benefit themselves. So again, let's use an accountant at an auto dealership. Let's say the accountant cooks the books or changes numbers in the books to make it look like they sold less vehicles, so the company has to pay less taxes, right? And the boss is like, you should do this, right? And the boss puts pressure on them. That's corporate crime. If the accountant sets up a separate checking account for themselves and diverts money from the business account to their personal account, that's white collar crime. You see the difference? Okay. What's the term for where people commit crimes over and over and over again? Like somebody gets out of jail and they reoffend. What's that called?
I just call them repeat.
So that there's a technical term for that. That's called criminal recidivism. Recidivism, it's one of the terms in the chapter. Recidivism is the rate at which people reoffend. Okay? So they actually track this. Like one of my good friends, Nate, you guys will laugh at this, but we're on the security team at church together. Okay? Does that surprise you? I'm on the security team?
No.
Okay? So he's a parole officer. Okay, so he has like 80 people that have committed crimes that he has to meet with and make sure they're following their parole and all that stuff. So he gets judged, like his work performance is in part based on how many of those people recommit crimes on the recidivism rate. Okay? So, what? Who is that?
What's that?
Some random guy walked in and made noise or what? Oh, okay. Okay. All right. And then we also talked about strain theory. Strain theory is Merton's theory that basically says like deviance depends on the ways you can accomplish goals, remember the means, and then also the opportunity people have to accomplish those goals or not. And then tomorrow we'll talk about what's called differential association theory. Differential association theory basically says that if you want to understand deviance, you have to understand who people hang out with, right? So this is why, like, again, I kind of laugh about this, but I'm going to have some say over who my daughter's friends are, right? So she gets in high school and she brings somebody home and they've got like a marijuana leaf necklace and like a beanie that says legalize it, right? And a hemp necklace and like they listen to Bob Marley all the time, right? You're not hanging out with my daughter, okay? Because they're probably a stoner, right? So differential association theory basically says that you become who you hang out with. Like, you're more likely to be deviant if you hang out with people that are deviant.
Wait, what's that called?
Differential association theory. Okay, so I want to give you some scenarios and then I want you to identify which theory applies the most to that scenario, okay? Okay, so let's say somebody tells them, hey, I'll retweet that stuff you tweeted if in return you will retweet what I tweet. That's exchange theory, right? Okay. What about, let's say if one person sees the fact that somebody didn't like one of their tweets and then they start to believe or interpret that that person doesn't really like them. SI theory. Okay, good. What about with social media, like how people learn and grow, like people in society learn and grow by like watching the news or reading stuff. That's functionalism, right? Okay. What about like in a relationship, somebody like buys you a present and then later you feel like you should buy them one. Exchange theory, okay? What about like how there's different standards of like beauty for like men and women. Men like want something and they use that to make sure they get what they want, and for women there's different standards that are kind of unfair. Conflict theory, okay? So be able to identify like in deviance, in mass media, in sexuality, and in groups and organizations, like which terms or which theories would associate the most. Yep.
Can you explain why that last one was conflict theory?
Okay, so when you talk about like status, so some of the key variables to look at would be power, exploitation, or like taking advantage of different groups, and then like hierarchy. If you see stuff related to that, generally it's going to be conflict theory, okay? So if it talks about inequality between men and women, or like for sexuality, like there's norms in college that like if you're a guy and you brag to your buddies, you're like, yeah, this weekend I hooked up with 3 girls, and last weekend it was 3 girls, your buddies would be like, all right, high five you, whatever. If a girl said that to her friends, what would her friends say? Okay, they'd label her as a slut, right? So conflict theorists argue that men as a group perpetuate those norms to make sure that like they can keep women in their place, right? That's a conflict analysis, okay? What's the concept of medicalization of deviance? We talked about that today.
I believe it's, oh yeah, a moral failing versus a disease.
Yeah, so medicalization of deviance basically is in the past, things were identified as like a moral failing, or maybe not necessarily a moral failing, but a problem. And then now it's like a medical problem, right? So you have an issue, like if you put stuff off and you don't want to do anything, you procrastinate, right? Like now, if you look in the DSM, the book used to identify disorders, right? In psychology, that's one of the defining symptoms of anxiety. Okay, putting stuff off, right? So in the past, it was like, you need to quit procrastinating. Now it's like, you're overcome with anxiety, you're too nervous to start. That's a sign of anxiety, okay? All right? Okay, to a guard working in a prison, what type of organization is that? Normative, utilitarian, or coercive? Not to the guard, right? Guard's getting paid to work there. Utilitarian, okay? To a buddy of mine I used to work out with, his name's Will Dort. He owns Skills Cuts. Has anybody heard? Do you know Will? Yeah, he's a great guy. Remember the story I told you about Brian, the guy that would like lift and scream and then shake people's hands? So it was like me, Will, Brian. There's an older guy that worked out there, Mara Lee's husband. She works in the library. Randy was his name. Good group of guys at Y West. So Will was on the news. He works in prison ministry, right? So he goes to the Cass County Jail and does like Bible studies for people that are in prison, right? So to him, what type of organization is prison? Normative, okay? To the prisoner, what type of organization is it?
Coercive.
Coercive, okay? What did Milgram research again? Obedience, whether or not people would shock individuals and obey an authority figure, right? What is a social institution that's used to spread information to a wide audience called? Mass media, yep, good. What's the key difference between social media and mass media? What's the key difference between social and mass media?
Social media is used for social interaction.
Yeah, so social media is less centralized. So mass media, CBS News, ABC News, they're pushing it out. So it's more like ground level up. And then it's also more participatory in nature, okay? So individuals play a larger role in spreading messages through social media, okay? That's the main difference, okay? as it relates to social media, what's the idea of presentation of self? Like, what's an example of that in social media? Remember how we talked about Charles Horton Cooley's looking glass self? So what's the idea of presentation of self, and how does that relate to social media? Yep.
Well, you want to make yourself look good for other people, and a good example would be filters that
Yeah.
you use on yourself.
Filters, or you do a selfie, you gotta look like this because it makes the chin fat go away or whatever. You don't go like this, right? Okay, so getting the right angles of pictures, right? Being intentional. Presentation of self is being intentional about how you present yourself to others because you want them to have a certain belief about you, right? Okay, so that involves dress, how you tweet, how you post, whatever. Okay, so in general, people present idealized images of themselves, right? So unless you're messing around with your friend or whatever, but you post something, the typical person will take multiple pictures before they post. Okay. What did Marx come up with? What theory? Conflict theory. Yep. What is the trend with mass media over time? Like CBS News, the New York Times, the Forum. Have there been more smaller companies starting, or are the smaller companies getting bought out by bigger companies?
Definitely the latter.
Yeah, so what's that called, that process by which they unify together?
Assimilation.
No. That's called media consolidation. So like Disney has been buying out a bunch of things. They bought out the rights to like 21st Century Fox stuff to try to build up and set up what's called Disney Plus. Have you heard of that? So it's like a competitor to Netflix that's starting November 12th. We're thinking about getting our kids that for Christmas. So has anybody heard of Disney Plus?
Yeah.
Looks kind of cool maybe if you like Disney movies. What's the most important primary group in society?
The family.
Family, definitely. Yep. Okay, we talked about the Lauman study on sexuality. Remember they identified kind of thirds, okay? So what were the ratios like in terms of sexual activity of adults?
Like the
Married,
different
monogamous couples have most.
Okay, so monogamous married couples engage in sexual activity the most, report enjoying it more, like there's a lot of functionalists would emphasize that, right? It's more functional. But in terms of, remember the third, in terms of the sheer engaging in activity. So a third of people in the United States have sex maybe once a year or not at all, a couple times a year. A third have sex a couple times a month, and then a third have sex like 4 times a week or so, okay? So that's on average, that's one research of the Lauman study. What are some of the functions of deviance? We talked about that on Monday. Like, what does deviance do? Remember I had them written on the board. What are some functions of deviance?
Unite society in what, and how they perceive good or evil.
Yeah, so to clarify moral boundaries, to unite people in cooperative groups,
How strong norms are.
okay, to identify norms and clarify norms and boundaries, right? Exactly. What's up? Yeah, also to lead to social change too. So what might be considered deviant for a while over time is considered normal. When I went to college, me and this guy in my English class, like we had Walkmans, like the CD players, little portable ones, and we were both super excited for a new CD to come out. So then when the CD came out, music comes out typically on Tuesdays. So then the next day we had class on Wednesday, both of us came into class wearing our earphones listening to music, and people were like, you guys are weird for listening to music and walking around. Okay, how many people do that now? A whole bunch of people, right? So what might have been perceived as weird in the past is now acceptable. Sometimes it changes the other way, right? So like what might have been considered normal in the past now is considered weird. So like getting married when you're 20 years old or so now is considered kind of abnormal. All right, so we also talked about, I just want to go through Merton's strain theory again. Remember the boxes we talked about? Okay. So you have to understand the goals and the means, right? So Merton used the term strain to identify the tension people experience when there's a societal goal that they can't achieve, right? So what if somebody accepts the goal and accepts the traditional means? So the example I used was trying to make more money, going to college. What's that called? Conformity, right? Starting a business, working hard, trying to get promoted. That's conformity. What if you accept the goal, like you want to make money?
Process by allowing us to anticipate what others expect of us.
That's fine. What if you want to make money but you reject the traditional means or ways? What's that called? Innovation. Yep. So I use the example of the guy that went to college with me, my RA, who programmed computers to like answer survey questions so you could get paid for surfing online. So you get paid a little bit each month for that. But okay, what if you accept the means, so you kind of go through the motion with the means, but you don't really care about the goal? What's that called? Ritualism. Yep. Okay. And then what's it called when you reject the goal and reject the means? So you live in your mom's basement. Retreatism. Okay. And then what if you completely come up with new goals and new means? What's that called? Rebellion. So there's like 3 questions on the test where it gives you a scenario. You have to identify which one's which. Okay. All right. So review session is done. Unless people have any questions, you can feel free to stick around if you have questions or whatever. Yep. Ritualism, an example of that is like somebody that like goes to a job but doesn't really try that hard. They just go over and over again. So they accept the means, they like go to work, but they don't really care as much about the goals.
Do you want me to stop it?
Yeah, you can stop.